The first time Susan Slater touched Nelson Garrett's broken gate, she had no intention of being noticed. The sun had barely cracked the horizon over Cutter's Creek, Colorado, in the autumn of 1878, painting the sky in shades of copper and bruised violet, and Susan was already moving through the early morning chill with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had learned to occupy herself before grief had a chance to settle in her bones. She carried a small leather satchel over one shoulder, the kind a seamstress might use, though inside it held not thread and needles but a small hammer, a handful of nails, a coil of wire, and a worn pair of leather-work gloves that had once belonged to her late husband, Thomas Slater, who had been dead 14 months and who had never once fixed a fence in his life, but had owned every tool a person might need to do so. Susan was 31 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept braided tight against her neck, gray eyes that had the particular quality of storm clouds that have not yet decided what to do, and hands that were calloused and capable in ways that embarrassed some men and reassured others. She was neither a fragile woman nor a hard one. She was simply a woman who had been left behind in a world that did not make it particularly easy to be left behind, and she had decided early on that the alternative to getting up was lying down, and lying down was something she refused to do. She had moved to Cutter's Creek 8 months after Thomas died, leaving behind the dry misery of their failed homestead near Pueblo, where the soil had turned against them and the creditors had not. Her sister, Clara, lived here with her husband, a decent man who ran a feed store on the main street, and it was Clara who had found Susan the small house on the eastern edge of town, a 2-room affair with a sagging porch and a kitchen garden that needed revival, situated directly across the rutted road from the largest cattle ranch in the county. That ranch belonged to Nelson Garrett. Susan had not paid much attention to Nelson Garrett in the first week she lived there. She had been too busy learning the rhythms of her new life, too busy reestablishing herself as a woman who could exist on her own terms, which in 1878 in Colorado was not as simple a thing as it might sound. A widow without children, without a family name that meant anything locally, without money beyond what she could earn taking in sewing and helping at the dry goods store 3 days a week, was a particular kind of invisible that society both pitied and ignored. Susan had grown accustomed to this invisibility and had decided to use it as she pleased. What she noticed about Nelson Garrett's ranch in those first weeks was not Nelson Garrett himself but the front gate. It was a heavy, handsome thing made of iron-strapped timber, hung between 2 thick posts of rough-hewn pine, designed to swing wide enough to let a cattle herd pass through. It bore the brand of the Garrett Ranch, a simple G inside a circle, burned into the top crossbeam, and it was broken. The upper hinge had partially pulled free from the post on the left side, so that the gate hung at a stubborn angle, neither closing properly nor opening without effort, scraping against the ground with a low groan whenever the wind moved it or a ranch hand pushed it open to let horses through. Susan noticed it the way she noticed all things that were wrong and fixable. It was a habit she had developed during her marriage, when noticing things and fixing them had been the difference between a functional household and a disastrous one. Thomas had been a dreamer, charming and warm and entirely useless with practical matters, and Susan had loved him for what he was while quietly managing everything he was not. She did not resent him for it. She missed him for it, sometimes, the particular weight of being the competent one, because at least when he was alive the competence had a purpose beyond herself. The gate bothered her the way an unfinished sentence bothers a reader. She told herself, on that first morning in mid-September when she crossed the road before sunrise and examined the hinge more closely, that she was simply curious. She told herself, when she opened her satchel and extracted the hammer and a nail and the length of wire, that it was a small thing, the work of 10 minutes, and that it cost her nothing, and that a gate swinging and groaning in the wind at 4 in the morning when a woman was trying to sleep was a neighborly grievance anyone would address. She fixed the hinge. Or rather, she reinforced it, the iron having pulled partly free of the wood so that the bolt threads no longer caught properly. She drove in 2 additional nails at an angle to brace the iron plate, wound the wire tightly around the post where it had begun to split, and tested the gate with both hands. It swung clean and quiet. She went home, made her coffee, and got on with her day. The next morning, the hinge had loosened again. Susan stood in the gray pre-dawn light and looked at it for a moment with an expression that her sister Clara would have recognized immediately as the one she wore when she was making a decision she had already made and was merely informing herself of it. She set down her satchel, pulled on her gloves, and fixed it again, this time with 2 longer nails she had thought to bring, driving them deep into the post where the wood was still solid. The morning after that, one of the iron straps along the gate's frame had cracked at a weld point, and the whole left side sagged worse than before. Susan stood there in the chill, watching the gate sway in the early morning wind off the mountains, and felt something very close to personal offense. She fixed it anyway. This was how it began. The Garrett Ranch was a prosperous operation. That much was plain to anyone who had eyes. It ran several hundred head of cattle across several thousand acres of good Colorado grassland, had a bunkhouse for half a dozen cowboys, a stable that held 20 horses, and a main house that was large by local standards, 2 stories of solid timber and stone with a wide covered porch that faced the mountains. Nelson Garrett had built most of it himself in the years since he had arrived in Cutter's Creek in 1869. A 23-year-old man with 2 horses, a modest inheritance from an uncle in Missouri, and the kind of stubborn industry that the land either rewarded or destroyed. It had rewarded him. He was 40 years old in the autumn of 1878, broad-shouldered and lean, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples, and a face that the Colorado sun had weathered into something that belonged there, angular and honest, with deep-set dark eyes that were observant in the way that men who have spent years reading weather and cattle and terrain become observant. He was not a man who wasted words. He ran his ranch with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned early that every hour had a cost, and he was respected in Cutter's Creek in the straightforward way that competence and fairness earn respect in small communities where everyone knows your business. He had been married once. Her name had been Margaret, and she had died of fever 6 years ago, leaving him with no children, only the ranch and the particular silences that a house acquires when the person who made it warm is gone. He had not courted anyone since, which was the subject of considerable speculation in town and zero conversation at his own kitchen table, because Nelson Garrett had decided at some point in those 6 quiet years that he had no talent for wanting things he was not sure he could keep. He did not know, in the first weeks of September, that his gate was being fixed every morning before sunrise. His foreman, a stocky and cheerful Mexican man named Augusto Vila, who had worked for Nelson since the early years and who had opinions about everything and the patience to voice most of them at length, noticed it first. "Somebody's been at the front gate," Augusto told Nelson on the 4th morning as they walked out together to begin the day's work. "Fix the hinge again. Did you send one of the boys?" "I didn't send anyone," Nelson said, stopping to examine the gate. The wire wrapping was neat and tight, the new nails driven at a precise angle that suggested someone who knew what they were doing. Maybe one of the hands took it upon themselves. Augusto asked around. None of the cowboys had touched it. Nelson ran his hand along the bracing work and said nothing for a moment, then went on with his day. On the 5th morning he rose a half-hour earlier than usual, just as the sky was beginning to go gray, and looked out his bedroom window toward the front gate. He saw nothing. By the time he was dressed and downstairs and out the front door, the gate had been reinforced with what appeared to be a fresh piece of wire and 2 new nails, and whoever had done it was gone. Nelson stood at his own front gate in the cool September morning and looked across the road at the small house that had been empty for years, until the widow from Pueblo had moved in. He had seen her a few times, the way you see neighbors in passing. A woman with dark red hair walking into town, carrying groceries, hanging laundry. He did not know her name. He had not introduced himself, which in retrospect was a failure of basic courtesy. But he had been busy and he was not naturally given to social calls, and he had told himself he would get around to it. He looked at the gate again, at the careful, competent work, and went inside to make his coffee. By the second week, Susan had fallen into the routine so completely that it did not feel like a routine at all, but simply part of her morning. She woke before dawn, dressed, made tea, and crossed the road with her satchel in the thin dark before the ranch stirred. The gate was always different in some new and specific way. The wood was old, and the iron fittings had been installed by someone who had not accounted for the expansion and contraction that the Colorado temperature swings demanded, and so the whole thing was in a state of slow structural defeat that offered new challenges almost daily. One morning it was a split board in the gate's frame. Another morning, the latch pin had worked itself loose and fallen somewhere in the dirt, and Susan spent 20 minutes on her knees with a candle lantern finding it and driving it home with a rock because she had not brought her hammer that day, and learned immediately never to come without it again. She found herself looking forward to it in a way she could not quite explain, or perhaps could explain but chose not to examine too closely. The gate was a problem. Problems were satisfying to solve. The early morning quiet, the cold air off the mountains that smelled of pine and coming frost, the physical small work of hammer and nail and wire, these things organized her mind for the day in a way that nothing else did quite so well. She was not, she told herself, doing it for any reason other than that it needed doing and no one else was doing it. She did not let herself think about the man who owned the gate, or rather, she thought about him in the practical, impersonal way she thought about the gate itself, as a problem adjacent to her but not belonging to her, interesting in outline but not her business. This was a lie she told herself with considerable skill. The truth was that she had seen Nelson Garrett on 3 separate occasions now, and each time something about him had registered in a way she was not ready to acknowledge. Once, he had been crossing the yard in the early evening, carrying a saddle over one arm with the casual ease of a man accustomed to wait, and the low sun had caught the silver in his hair, and he had paused to look at the mountains for a moment in a way that suggested he was not simply looking but listening for something, some answer in the landscape that he had not stopped trying to find. Once she had seen him speaking to one of his hands near the stable, and even from a distance she could read the quality of the exchange, patient and direct, a man who corrected without humiliating, which in her experience was rarer than it should have been. And once, just once, she had been coming back from town in the late afternoon and he had been at the far end of his porch, sitting in a wooden chair, reading something, a newspaper or a letter she could not tell, and he had looked up as she passed and their eyes had met for a moment across the road. He had nodded to her. She had nodded back. Neither had spoken. She thought about that nod more than she thought was reasonable. Clara noticed, because Clara noticed everything and had the annoying habit of saying so over the kitchen table on Sunday afternoons. "You've got that look again," Clara said, pouring coffee, regarding her sister with the calm certainty of someone holding excellent cards. "I don't have any look," Susan said. "The one where you're thinking about something you've decided not to think about. You used to get it when you were planning how to pay the rent and didn't want to worry Thomas." "I'm thinking about the Hender's dress order. The trim on the bodice isn't laying right, and I need to figure out if it's the cut or the fabric." "It's the rancher across the road," Clara said pleasantly and picked up her coffee cup. Susan looked at her sister for a long moment. "I am fixing his gate. His gate needs fixing and no one is fixing it and I am fixing it. That is the full extent of the matter." "Why are you fixing it?" "Because it needs fixing." "Susan, a lot of things in this world need fixing. You don't cross the road before sunrise every single morning to fix them all." "The gate is directly across from my bedroom window and the wind moves it in the night and I can hear it." This was true. It was not the whole truth, but it was true, and Susan felt this was sufficient. Clara smiled into her coffee and said nothing more, which was worse than if she had continued arguing. By the third week of September, Nelson had worked out that it was the widow from across the road who was fixing his gate every morning. He had not confirmed this directly, but had deduced it with the same methodical patience he applied to tracking weather patterns and cattle movements, by elimination of other possibilities and attention to timing. He had risen before 4 in the morning twice in the past week, and had watched from the upstairs window as a small figure in a dark coat crossed the road with a lantern and a bag, and spent somewhere between 10 and 30 minutes at the gate before disappearing back across the road. He had not gone out to speak to her. This was not because he did not want to. He was not sure why he had not gone out. He told himself it was because he did not want to embarrass her, because there was clearly something purposeful in the fact that she came before dawn, before anyone was watching, and whatever her reasons, he did not want to strip away the privacy of the act by turning it into an audience. He told himself that. He also told himself other things that were less easy to organize into sentences, and so he left them alone. He asked Augusto what he knew about the woman across the road. Augusto, who knew everything about everyone in Cutter's Creek because he went to church and attended the Saturday market, and had 5 children who attended school and therefore had access to the complete social intelligence of the town, told him her name was Susan Slater, that she was a widow from Pueblo, that her husband had died about a year and a half ago of a fall from a horse, that she had no children, that she did sewing and alterations and worked part-time at the dry goods store, that she was well liked by the women in town and notably self-sufficient, and that she had a sister named Clara who was married to Hector Boyd's who ran the feed store. 31, Augusto added, because he knew Nelson would wonder and was too proud to ask. Nelson said, "I didn't ask." "No," Augusto agreed, and went off to find something useful to do. Nelson thought about Susan Slater for the rest of that morning and part of the afternoon, which was not characteristic of him, and which he noted with the mild alarm of a man who has kept his own internal weather calm for a long time and feels the first pressure change of an approaching front. The gate continued its slow deterioration. The wood was simply too old, some of the original joinery weakening at the points where summer drought and early autumn cold had worked on it alternately for years. Susan had begun bringing a small pry bar in addition to her other tools, which allowed her to address the deeper structural problems rather than just the surface symptoms. And on the morning of September 22nd, she spent nearly 40 minutes on the gate and left it in better shape than it had been in probably years. She was pulling her gloves off in the pre-dawn dark, her breath visible in the cold air, when she heard the sound. It was a low sound, almost below hearing, a horse in distress coming from somewhere inside the ranch yard. She stood still for a moment, listening, and heard it again, a strained, rhythmic effort that cut through the quiet. She looked toward the stable. The main doors were closed, but there was light showing under them, thin and yellowish. Susan picked up her satchel and went to look. She pushed the stable door open and was hit immediately by the smell of blood and sweat and the particular panicked warmth of a large animal in trouble. At the far end of the stable in the largest stall, a bay mare was down on her sides heaving, her legs making slow churning movements, and beside her was Nelson Garrett on his knees in the straw, his shirt sleeves pushed up to his elbows, his face drawn with focus and what Susan recognized, even in this first real proximity, as controlled fear. He was saying something low to the horse that she could not hear, his hands working at something. "Is it the foal?" Susan asked, because she had grown up on a farm in Missouri and she knew what this looked like. Nelson's head came up. He looked at her with an expression that contained surprise, recognition, and desperate practicality in such quick succession that it was almost a single expression. "Yes," he said. "She's been in labor 4 hours. The foal is positioned wrong. I've been trying to turn it, but my hands are—" He glanced down at his large hands and did not finish. Susan set down her satchel and took off her coat. "Your hands are too big," she said. "Let me. You know horses." He asked, not doubtfully but with the direct assessment of a man who needs to know right now if he can rely on you. "My father raised horses," she said. "I've done this before." For a moment he just looked at her, this woman who had been fixing his gait in the dark every morning for 3 weeks, and something crossed his face that she could not fully read, but that made her feel seen in a way she was not accustomed to. "All right," he said, and moved back. It took 40 minutes and all the strength her arms had, and Nelson was there beside her the whole time, doing exactly what she asked when she asked it, passing the lamp closer, steadying the mare's head, talking to the animal in that low, steady voice that seemed to work on Susan's own nerves almost as effectively as on the horses. When the foal finally came, a brown and white colt, small and trembling and magnificently alive, Susan sat back on her heels in the straw with blood on her forearms and her hair coming loose from its braid, and felt the specific exhilaration of having fought something and won. Nelson watched the colt struggle to its feet with the expression of a man who has been holding his breath and only now remembers to exhale. Then he looked at Susan. "That would not have gone well without you," he said. "It went well," she said. "That's what matters." "I should know your name," he said, and there was something in how he said it quietly, simply, without any of the social formality that the sentence might otherwise have carried, that made it feel like something other than an introduction. Like the beginning of something he had been wanting to say for a while. "Susan Slater," she said. "Nelson Garrett." He paused. "I know you've been fixing my gait." She looked at him steadily, the way she looked at things she had decided not to be embarrassed about. "It needs fixing," she said. "Every morning for almost a month," he said. "I'd like to know why." Susan considered this. She looked at the colt, which had found its mother and was nursing with unsteady determination, and she thought about all the things she might say and all the things that were true and which ones overlapped. "Because it's there," she said at last, "and because it's broken, and because," she stopped. "Because," he said. "Because fixing things gives me something to do with my hands before the rest of the day starts," she said, which was true enough and incomplete enough that she could live with it. He nodded slowly, as if this made sense to him in a way that went beyond the surface of the words. "Come up to the house," he said. "You need to wash up, and I owe you coffee at minimum." She looked at the blood on her forearms and then at him and said, "All right." The Garrett house was large and clean and noticeably undecorated, the kind of place that showed the marks of a woman's absence in the absence of things rather than the presence of neglect. The bare windowsills where curtains would have been, the plain pine table without a cloth, the good iron cookstove that was functional but not arranged with any thought to how a kitchen could also be warm. Susan noticed all of this the way she noticed things, quickly and without comment. Nelson pumped water at the basin, and she washed her arms while he built up the fire in the stove and put the coffee pot on. They moved around each other in the kitchen with an ease that surprised her, or maybe it did not surprise her but simply confirmed something she had been careful not to think about for 3 weeks. "How long has she been that way?" Susan asked, meaning the mare. "She seemed too thin for that stage." "I bought her at auction in August," Nelson said, his back to her as he measured coffee. "She was in worse shape when I got her. She's been improving, but she was underfed through the first part of the pregnancy. I was worried she wouldn't carry to term." "She's strong," Susan said. "The foal is strong, they'll both be fine. I know that now." He turned and set a mug on the table and looked at her in the lamplight, and Susan found that this proximity, here in this kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and old pine and the particular masculine quiet of a man who lived alone without apology, was doing something to her composure that she was going to have to manage carefully. "Your husband," he said. "I heard he passed." 14 months ago," she said. "A horse threw him. He broke his neck." "I'm sorry." "He was a good man," she said. "He had no practical sense whatsoever and he laughed at almost everything, and he was the worst at fixing things I have ever known. But he was genuinely good." Nelson was quiet for a moment, wrapping both hands around his own mug. "My wife died 6 years ago," he said. "Fever." "I know," Susan said, and then immediately, "I asked about you. Clara's husband knows everything." Something that might have been a smile, not quite formed but present, moved across Nelson Garrett's face. "Did you ask before or after you started fixing my gate?" Susan picked up her coffee and considered the question with the absolute certainty that she was not going to answer it truthfully. "After," she said, which was a lie. She had asked the second week, which was before the fourth morning, and she knew it, and she was fairly certain from the way his eyes moved that he knew it too, though he let it pass with the consideration of a man who understood that some truths needed to arrive in their own time. They drank their coffee in the gray early morning, and outside the sky had begun to go from black to the dark purple that preceded real dawn, and somewhere a rooster made its preliminary announcement to the world. Susan thought about going home. She did not go home for another hour, during which they talked about horses and about Cutter's Creek, and about the winter coming, which the old-timers said would be severe, and about Susan's kitchen garden, which she had brought back to productivity in a single season, and about the cut of timber in the mountain east of town that Nelson needed to arrange before the snow came. They did not talk about anything that was important, and yet everything they said was in some way important, in the way that the first real conversation with a person you have been watching from a distance always is. It is the moment when the outline fills in, when what you have imagined from a distance either collapses under the weight of the real person or deepens into something more complex and interesting. And Susan found, sitting at Nelson Garrett's bare kitchen table with blood still caught under her fingernails and her hair half down her back, that Nelson Garrett was considerably more interesting than his outline had suggested. He was direct without being blunt, thoughtful without being slow, and he listened in the particular way that people who have lived alone for a long time sometimes learn to listen, with complete attention, as if the person speaking is saying something worth hearing until proven otherwise. He did not try to fill every silence, and Susan, who had spent years in a marriage where the silences were hers to manage, found this deeply restful. She walked home in the early morning light, feeling something she had not felt in a very long time, and was going to have to think about carefully before she knew what to do with it. The next morning she came back to the gate. The colt, she could see from across the road, was on its feet in the paddock beside the stable, a small brown and white figure in the early light, and she felt a rush of pleasure at the sight of it that was disproportionate to her involvement and did not care. The gate had a new problem. The latch mechanism had finally given way entirely. The iron bolt cracked through at its thinnest point, which meant the gate would not stay closed at all and would have to be physically braced until a new latch could be fitted. Susan assessed this with her hands on her hips and then went to the gate post on the left side, where there was a loop of old wire already there from a previous repair, and used it in combination with a length of her own wire to fashion a temporary clasp that would hold for a few days. She had just finished testing it when she heard boots on the gravel. She did not look up immediately. She already knew the sound of his particular walk. "I thought I'd see you this morning," Nelson said. "The latch bolt cracked," she said. "That wire hold will last 2 or 3 days, but you need a new bolt and latch plate. The blacksmith in town can make one, or you can order from the supply catalog, but the catalog takes 2 weeks and winter is coming." Nelson looked at the repair for a moment. Then he looked at her. The morning was cold and she had her coat on and her breath made small clouds in the air, and there was still a faint smear of yesterday's work on her left wrist that she had not quite reached with the washcloth. "I've been up since 3, he said, "checking on the mare and the colt." He paused. "They're both well." "I saw," she said, nodding toward the paddock. "I'm going to call the colt Franklin," he said, "after a horse my father had." "Franklin," she repeated. "That's a respectable name for a horse." "Come see him," Nelson said. It was not quite an invitation and not quite a request. It was something in between, offered simply, without pressure or performance. Susan looked at him for a moment. The sky behind the mountains had gone amber at the edges, and the morning light was the particular soft gold that only came in Colorado in late September, when the air had enough chill in it to make the light feel more precious. Nelson Garrett was standing at his own gate in this light with his hat in his hands, which she realized she had not seen before, and his dark eyes were very direct and very patient, which was the most unsettling combination she had encountered in some time. "All right," she said. Franklin was marvelous. He was already curious and unafraid, which Nelson said was a good sign, and he had a white blaze on his forehead that made him look constantly interested in everything. And Susan stood at the paddock fence and watched him investigate the world with the total confidence of something very young and completely unaware that things could go wrong, and felt, unexpectedly, her throat tighten. "He doesn't know yet," she said, "that things can be hard." "No," Nelson said beside her at the fence. "He gets a little while of just being himself first." She looked at him. He was watching the colt with an expression that was entirely unguarded, and she thought that this was perhaps the most honest face she had seen on anyone in a very long time. "That's a kind thing to say," she said. "It's just true," he said. They stood there for a few minutes more in the cold morning light, not speaking, watching Franklin practice being in the world, and Susan was aware with every part of her that Nelson was standing close enough that if she moved her hand 6 inches to the right she would be touching his arm, and this awareness was something that lived in her chest and hummed. She went home. She went to the dry goods store. She sewed 3 inches of trim on the hinder dress and ripped it out and did it again. She thought about Nelson Garrett all day with the resigned attention of someone who has tried not to think about something, and discovered that not thinking about something is itself a form of thinking about it. That evening, Clara came over with a jar of preserved peaches and a look of serene satisfaction that Susan found intolerable. "I heard you were at the Garrett ranch this morning," Clara said. "Hector saw you come back when he was opening the store." "I went to see the new colt," Susan said. "I helped deliver it yesterday." Clara's expression elevated from serene to radiant. "You delivered his horse's foal." "Yes. And then you had coffee." Susan looked at her sister. "How do you know that?" "Augusto Vila's wife Rosa was at the well when Rosa saw smoke from the Garrett chimney at an unusual hour and mentioned it to All Right," Susan said. "Yes, we had coffee. He was being courteous. I had been useful, that is all." Clara opened the peaches. "And is he everything your gate fixing suggested he might be?" "I am going to finish this dress trim," Susan said. "You can let yourself out." Clara laughed and stayed for 2 more hours, and Susan did not mind. The next morning Susan went to the gate with a genuine purpose, having thought the night before about what it actually needed structurally, which was not just a new latch, but a reassessment of the entire hanging mechanism. The gate was too heavy for its hinges as originally installed, probably because whoever had hung it had not accounted for the wood swelling with moisture over the years. She had thought about this lying in her bed looking at the ceiling, and had worked out a solution that involved repositioning the upper hinge slightly and adding a third one at the midpoint. She was knee-deep in this project. The gate unhung and laid flat on sawhorses she had borrowed from Clara's barn without asking, one hinge already removed, and the screw holes packed with wooden plugs cut from a piece of scrap pine she had brought in her bag, when she heard the creak of the porch door and looked up to find Nelson standing on the porch of his house watching her with an expression she could not read at this distance. He came across the yard. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the gate laid flat and at the sawhorses and at the organized arrangement of tools on the post top and at Susan, who was on one knee with a brace drill, and said nothing for a moment. "You're rehanging it," he said. "The original hanging was wrong," she said. "The gate is too heavy for 2 hinges positioned that way. I'm going to add a third and reset the first one lower so the weight distributes better. It won't keep failing after this." Nelson was quiet for a moment. Then he crouched down beside the gate and looked at the packed screw holes and the hinge she had already moved and the careful marking she had done on the wood to show where the new hardware would go. "This is good work," he said. It was not an observation. It was a statement of genuine recognition, the kind that someone who knows what good work looks like makes when they see it. "The bolt is on your porch," she said. "I went to the blacksmith yesterday afternoon and asked Harlan to make up a new latch bolt and plate. He had them this morning. I left them on your steps." Nelson was quiet again in a way that she was beginning to understand was not absence but the opposite of it, full attention that hadn't yet found its words. "Why are you doing all of this?" he asked. Not the casual inquiry of someone making conversation, but a real question, asked quietly, asked as if the answer mattered. Susan kept her hands moving on the drill, taking her time with the new hole, not looking at him. "Because it needs doing," she said. "Susan." The way he said her name made her stop. She looked at him. He was watching her with those dark, patient eyes, close enough that she could see the weathered lines at their corners, lines that came from squinting into too much sun and wind, lines that on another face might have been harsh but on his were simply evidence of a life lived looking at things directly. "Why do you come every morning?" he asked. "For a month now, before anyone is awake. You don't have to do this." She sat back on her heels and looked at the gate lying flat in the morning light and thought about telling him something manageable, something that did not require her to say anything true. "I know I don't have to," she said at last. "I have been telling myself it's because the gate wakes me at night when the wind moves it, and that's true. I've been telling myself it's because broken things bother me, and that's true too. But that's not—" She stopped, and then continued because she had never been a woman who stopped when she should have kept going. "I lost my husband and I came to a new town where nobody knew me, and I started a small, quiet life, and that life is fine. It's sufficient. But I have been waking up every morning before dawn with my hands wanting something to do, and the gate gave them something." Nelson was listening with that complete attention. "And then," she said, "there was you." The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest silence Susan Slater had ever sat inside of. Nelson looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, quietly and with great care, "I watched you from the upstairs window the first week. I didn't go out. I didn't know why." "I think I know why," Susan said, with the particular courage of someone who has decided that honesty is less frightening than its alternative. "Tell me." "Because it was enough, for a while. Just to see someone fixing things in the dark because they needed fixing. And if you'd gone out and spoken to me, it would have stopped being just that. It would have been something else." Nelson's jaw moved. He looked at the gate, then at her. "And now it's something else." "Yes," Susan said simply. He put his hand out, not reaching for her but opening, palm up, resting it on the edge of the gate between them, and looked at her, and she looked at it, and then she put her hand in his. His hand was large and warm and very calloused, and it closed around hers with the deliberate care of someone who was holding something they did not want to drop. They stayed like that for a moment in the morning cold, two people who had been alone for a long time and had arrived, through a broken gate and a month of mornings, at the simplest and most complicated place of all. "Finish the gate," he said. "And then come have breakfast, and this time don't rush off." "I have the hinder dress to finish," she said. "After breakfast," he said, "the dress can wait an hour." Susan smiled. It was not a small smile. It was the real kind, the one that reached her eyes and stayed there. "All right," she said, and went back to work. They hung the gate together that morning. Nelson was useful in ways that surprised her, following her direction without ego and offering suggestions that were good ones when he offered them. And by mid-morning the gate hung clean and true, and swung without effort and latched with the new bolt with a solid, satisfying click. They stood side by side and looked at it, and Susan felt the particular completion of a job done right. And then Nelson said, "It's a fine gate now," and she said, "It was always a fine gate. It just needed to be understood," and she could feel him looking at her from the side in a way that had nothing to do with the gate. Breakfast was eggs from the Garrett hens and biscuits that Nelson made himself, which were not elegant but were solid and good. And they ate at the bare pine table in the kitchen, with the morning light coming through the window, and talked for almost 2 hours. Susan told him about Missouri, and about the farm she had grown up on, and about her father and the horses, and about meeting Thomas at a church social in the summer of her 19th year. How he had been the funniest man in the room and the worst dancer she had ever seen. and how she had agreed to dance with him a second time specifically to see if the first time had been an accident. Nelson listened and asked questions, real ones, not the polite variety, and she found herself saying things she had not said to anyone since Thomas died, small particular truths about who she had been and who she had become. In return, he told her about coming to Colorado with his uncle's inheritance and his 2 horses, and how the first winter had nearly killed him, not from cold but from sheer ignorance of the land, and how an old Ute man he had traded with that spring had taught him to read the mountain weather in ways that no book described, and how he had built the first section of the house by himself with timber he had cut and hauled with those same 2 horses, 1 board at a time over 3 months. Margaret came a year after, he said. I'd been in town trying to hire a cook, and I met her at the boarding house where she was staying while she looked for work as a teacher. She was from Tennessee. She had opinions about everything, and she was right about most of them. He was quiet for a moment. She never liked winter. I love winter, Susan said. He looked at her. I know, he said. I've seen you. You come across the road in the worst cold and you never hurry. Most people hurry in the cold. Hurrying in the cold makes it worse, she said. If you move slowly enough, you stop fighting it and it becomes just a temperature. Nelson looked at her with an expression she was going to spend a lot of time thinking about later, a look of recognition so clear and simple that it was almost startling, as if she had said something he had been thinking for years without quite being able to say. He walked her home that morning across the road, which was 40 feet and entirely unnecessary and which she appreciated enormously. At her gate, which was a simple wooden affair that did not need fixing, he stopped and said, I'd like to call on you properly, on Sunday if that would be all right. Susan looked at him in the October light. He was holding his hat again, which she had decided was the thing he did when something mattered to him. It would be all right, she said. He came Sunday, with his hat and a decent jacket and what appeared to be genuine nerves, which Susan found disarming because she had not expected him to be nervous. She had expected him to be composed. He was composed, but underneath it there were nerves, visible in the slight set of his jaw and the way he stood at her door as if waiting for a verdict. And she thought that this was more intimate than anything he could have said, that he had let her see it. She made coffee and they sat on her small porch in the afternoon and watched the road and talked. And after an hour she showed him the kitchen garden she had rebuilt from the dead-over plot she had found in the spring, the herbs still stubborn and green in the October cold, the last of the squash she had stored in the cellar. And he looked at the garden with the appreciation of someone who knew what went into making something grow and said, You built this from nothing in 1 season. And she said, Most things can be built from nothing if you know what they need. And they were not talking only about the garden, and they both knew it. He called on her the following Sunday and the one after that, and somewhere in the 3rd Sunday he stopped being nervous, and she stopped being careful, and the conversation deepened in the way that conversations do when 2 people have decided that they are safe with each other. They talked about the winter preparations, about the cattle he was bringing in from the high pastures before the snow, about her negotiations with the women of the town who wanted sowing done before the cold set in, about the town itself, which was growing. A bank had opened in August, and a new hotel was going up on the main street, and there was talk of a school expansion that Susan felt strongly about and said so at some length. Nelson listened to her views on the school expansion with complete seriousness and then said, The school board meets Thursday evenings at the courthouse. You should come. Women can't vote at the school board meetings, she said. Women can speak at them if they're recognized, he said. I have some standing with the board, I'll get you recognized. She looked at him. You do that. The school should be expanded, he said. You know more about what it needs than most of the men on the board. Yes, I do that. Susan felt something shift and settle in her chest at that, something she was going to think about later when she was alone and had the privacy to be honest about it. She went to the school board meeting. Nelson got her recognized. She made 3 specific points about the curriculum and the teacher's living situation, which was inadequate and was causing turnover, and the board voted to address 2 of the 3. It was not a complete victory. It was a partial one, and Susan had lived long enough to know the difference between the 2 and to be grateful for the partial ones. Afterward, Nelson walked her home from the courthouse, and the October night was cold and bright with stars, and she was talking about the 3rd point she had not won on, and somewhere in the middle of a sentence he stopped walking and she stopped too, and he looked at her in the starlight and said, "I think you might be the most capable person I have ever met." "That's a high claim," she said. "I mean it," he said. "I've known a lot of capable people. You're something different." The words hung between them in the cold night air. Susan looked at him and felt the full weight of everything the last 2 months had contained. The gate and the mornings and the foal and the coffee and the Sundays and the school board meeting and all the conversations in between, and the feeling in her chest that had been building like weather. "Nelson," she said. "Yes," he said, which was not quite an answer but felt like one. She stepped toward him and he met her halfway, and when he kissed her, it was with the same quality she had recognized in him from the beginning, deliberate and genuine and entirely without performance, and she kissed him back with everything she had not said in a month of early mornings. They stood in the middle of the road in the October night in Cutter's Creek, Colorado, and for a moment the town and the cold and the year and all its difficulties simply were not the most important thing happening in the world. He walked her to her door and said good night, and she watched him cross the road to his house and go inside, and then she stood in her own kitchen and held her own hands together and felt completely, quietly astonished at herself. October deepened into November and the first snow came, and it was a serious snow. The old-timers had been right, laying nearly a foot overnight and settling into the kind of cold that made the world blue and white and absolutely still. Susan woke the first morning of it and looked out the window at the transformed road and at the Garrett ranch across from it and at the front gate, which was still hanging straight and true, and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. She did not go to fix the gate that morning. There was nothing to fix. Instead, she put on her coat and boots and walked across the road and knocked on the front door of the Garrett house at 7 in the morning, with a loaf of bread she had baked before dawn, because she had woken early with her hands wanting something to do, and bread had been the answer. Nelson opened the door looking as if he had been up for hours, which he had, and looked at the bread and at her and at the snow and said, "Come in. The coffee is already on." She came in. She stayed for breakfast, and after breakfast Nelson said, "I need to check the north fence line today before the storm comes in again tonight. Will you come? I could use another pair of eyes, and the ride is good in the first snow." She said yes. They rode out on 2 of his best horses through the white-covered land under a sky so blue it seemed almost deliberate. And Susan had not been on a horse like this, open country, no destination except the work, in years, and she felt it opened something in her that had been closed. Nelson rode beside her and they talked and fell silent and talked again. And at the north fence line there were 3 posts that had been pushed loose by the elk herd that had moved through before the snow, and they worked together for an hour resetting them. And by the end, Susan's fingers were cold through her gloves, and Nelson took her hands in both of his and held them and looked at her face. "You're happy," he said, and it was not quite a question. "Surprisingly," she said. "Yes." He smiled then, a full real smile that she realized she had not seen at full intensity before, and it did something significant to his face, opened it completely, and she thought she would spend quite a lot of time in her life trying to cause it to appear. "Good," he said, and kept her hands in his for another moment before they mounted up and rode back. November was the month in which they became, without announcing it, a fixed pair in the eyes of Cutter's Creek. It happened the way these things happen in small towns, gradually and then all at once. Nelson was seen at Susan's house. Susan was seen at the ranch. They attended the autumn social at the church hall together, Susan in her best dark green wool dress that she had remade from an older cut, Nelson in a good jacket, and Clara met Susan's eyes from across the room with an expression so luminous with satisfaction that Susan had to look away to keep from laughing. The town approved. This was not guaranteed, because towns in the late 1870s had opinions about widows who moved on with something they sometimes called undue haste, and 14 months was on the shorter end of what propriety required. But Susan had established herself in those 8 months as someone hardworking and principled, and Nelson Garrett's character was known, and the people who had been in Cutter's Creek long enough to matter had decided that these two solitary, capable people had found each other, and that this was the right outcome. Augusto Vila, for his part, was so visibly pleased about it that he became slightly insufferable for several weeks and took full credit for the match on the basis of having provided the biographical information. "I told him your name," he told his wife Rosa. "Without that, where would they be?" "She was fixing his gate every morning," Rosa said. "I think they would have managed." "Eventually," Augusto said. "Eventually is not the same as now." December was cold and deep and white, and the snow stayed on the ground, and the mountains were absolute and close-looking against the sky, and Susan and Nelson moved into the deep comfort of a winter that neither of them was facing alone. She spent evenings at the ranch, cooking in the large kitchen that she began, slowly and with care, to make into a place that was warm in ways beyond the stove. A tablecloth on the pine table, a jar of rosemary from her dried herbs on the windowsill, the small particular changes that make a house into a home, each one made with the question asked and answered, and Nelson said yes to each one with a simplicity that told her these were not concessions but welcomings. In mid-December, on an evening when the snow was falling again and they had eaten together and were sitting by the fire, Nelson said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it straight." Susan looked at him across the fire. "I'm not good at speeches," he said. "I don't have one prepared. I have this house and this ranch, and I have, since September, whatever this is between us, which is the most important thing I have. And I'd like it to be permanent if you'll have it." She said, "Are you asking me to marry you, Nelson Garrett?" "Yes," he said, "I am." Susan looked at the fire for a moment, and in the fire she saw the past 14 months, the grief and the rebuilding and the new town and the gate in the dark and the foal and the straw and the coffee and the ride through the snow and his hands, always his hands, large and warm and careful. "Yes," she said, "I'll have it." He reached into the pocket of his jacket and brought out a ring, a simple one, a small garnet in a plain silver setting, not showy, not attempting to be more than it was. He had bought it from the jeweler in town and had apparently been carrying it for 2 weeks waiting for the right moment. He put it on her hand with the same deliberate care he brought to everything, and Susan looked at it on her finger and felt completely, entirely right. They were married in February, on a Saturday that arrived with stunning blue skies after a week of heavy snow, as if the weather had been saving this particular day. The ceremony was at the church in Cutter's Creek, officiated by Reverend Hollies, who was old and kind and had married half the county. Clara was Susan's witness, in her good Sunday wool, tears on her face from the moment she walked in that she did not bother to conceal. Augusto was Nelson's witness, in a jacket that was too tight across the shoulders and an expression of profound self-congratulation that was also genuine happiness. Susan wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored cotton and brown velvet ribbon, simple and well-cut and absolutely hers, and she wore her hair down for the first time in public since coming to Cutter's Creek, and Nelson, when he saw her at the church door, stopped walking for a moment and then continued with his hand outstretched and his eyes not leaving her face. The vows were traditional. The moment was not. When the Reverend pronounced them married and Nelson kissed her in front of the assembled church, the reaction from the congregation was loud enough to start the horses tied outside shifting against their posts. The reception was at Clara and Hector's house, and there was a fiddle player, a man named Pete Drawson, who played at every occasion in Cutter's Creek regardless of his invitation status, and dancing in the cleared sitting room that started at 3 in the afternoon and did not stop until the stars were out. Nelson danced with Susan 3 times, which in 1878 in a small Colorado town was a declaration in itself. And the third time he danced with her, the room had thinned to only the closest friends, and he held her closer and she let him. And Clara watched from the corner with Hector's arm around her and felt that the world was, at this particular moment, arranged correctly. Susan moved into the Garrett house the following Monday with 3 boxes of belongings, her sewing equipment, her kitchen garden tools, her books, which were more than Nelson had expected, and the leather satchel with the hammer and nails and wire which she hung on a hook by the back door. Nelson saw it there and said nothing, but something moved in his face when he looked at it. "It can go in the tool room," Susan said. "It can stay where it is," he said. She left it on the hook by the back door. Spring came to Cutter's Creek in late March, arriving with the mud and the meltwater and the particular violence of color that the Colorado spring produced after the white winter. And Susan's kitchen garden was the first place she went with the thaw, mapping out an expanded plot that would run alongside the house on the south side. And Nelson dug it for her over a weekend without being asked, turning the soil with a spade in the cold March sun, while she marked the rows with stakes and string. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, which was exactly what she had said to him about the gate, and they both recognized it, and she smiled so wide it felt like the sun. Franklin, the colt, had grown through the winter into a young horse of real quality, bold and sound, and with the particular energy of a well-raised animal. Susan had taken to riding him on mornings when the weather allowed, with Nelson's permission, and then without asking it because it was understood, and there was something that felt like completion in riding the horse she had helped bring into the world across the land she now lived on. The ranch prospered through that spring and summer. Nelson had made a good arrangement with the new rail line that had extended to a town 30 miles south, which meant he could move cattle to eastern markets without the cost and risk of the long drives, and the herd grew to a size that required an additional cowhand. He hired a young man named Samuel, a 22-year-old from Kansas who was hard-working and earnest, and who regarded Susan with the respectful wariness of someone who had been told she knew how to work, and had found this to be accurate. Susan built her sewing business in town through the spring and summer, adding 3 more regular clients, and taking on a commission for the new hotel owner's wife, who had come from Denver with elaborate expectations about frontier fashion that Susan navigated with diplomatic skill. She hired a young woman named Me, 17 and quick and eager to learn, as a part-time assistant, and spent part of her afternoons teaching me to cut and sew with the same patient precision she applied to everything. In May, Susan told Nelson she thought she was expecting. She told him on a Sunday morning, at the kitchen table, with the coffee between them and the mountain light coming through the windows. She had put curtains on in January, simple blue cotton that moved in the slight draft. She told him simply, the way she told him everything, directly and without preamble, watching his face as she said it. His face did something she had not seen it do before. It went through surprise and then something that was not quite disbelief but was its gentle cousin, and then it settled into something so open and unguarded that she felt it in her chest like a chord resolving. He reached across the table and took her hand and said, "You're sure?" "Fairly sure," she said. "I'm going to see Dr. Marsh on Tuesday." He held her hand and looked at the table for a moment and then at her, and his voice was not quite steady when he said, "I had not let myself want this." "I know," she said softly. "Because wanting things," he said, "has not always," he stopped. "Because wanting things you're not sure you can keep is frightening," she said, finishing the sentence she had heard him start 6 months ago at a gate in the September dark. "Yes," he said. She squeezed his hand. "You can want this," she said. "We can want this." Dr. Marsh confirmed it on Tuesday, and Nelson came with her to the appointment, which caused Dr. Marsh, who was 60 years old and had seen a great deal of this world, to look at them both over the top of his spectacles with an expression of gentle approval and say, "You'll want to be careful through the summer heat. Keep her rested, Garrett." I don't rest particularly, Susan said. No, said Dr. Marsh, who had heard about the gate and the foal and the school board meeting and the kitchen garden, as had everyone in Cutter's Creek. I imagine not. The summer of 1879 was a warm and busy one, and Susan was well through most of it, which Dr. Marsh said was a good sign, and she continued working at a modified pace, seeing clients at home when the heat made the walk to town inadvisable, and tending the kitchen garden in the cool mornings, and riding Franklin on the gentle paths through the lower pasture when the afternoon was bearable. Nelson watched over her with the focused care he brought to every important thing, in a way that was attentive without being suffocating, because he understood that Susan's capability was not separate from who she was but central to it, and suffocating it would have been a form of damage. He made her breakfast every morning. He came home from the range earlier than he needed to on the hottest days. He did not fuss, but he was present in all the ways that mattered. There was one particular evening in July, hot even at 8 in the evening, when Susan could not get comfortable and had been awake for 2 hours and had gone out to sit on the porch in the dark. Nelson came out after her without a word and brought 2 glasses of cool water from the well and sat beside her, and they sat in the summer dark looking at the road and the stars and the shape of the mountains against the sky, and the broken gate that was not broken any more stood at the entrance to the yard in the dark, hung true and straight, and Susan looked at it and thought about all the things it had been and all the things that had come after it. "What are you thinking?" Nelson asked. "About the gate," she said. "About September, about the first morning you fixed it, about the morning you asked me why," she said. "I didn't give you the whole answer." He turned to look at her in the dark. "Tell me now," he said. She thought about it for a moment, holding her water glass in both hands, feeling the cool of it. "I woke up the day after we moved to this town," she said, "and I lay in bed and thought, I am 30 years old and I am alone and the rest of my life is going to be just this, just sufficiency, just getting through. And I got up and I made tea and I looked out the window and I saw your gate hanging at that angle and I thought, that is a thing in the world that is wrong and that I can make right. And I put on my coat and I went out and fixed it." She paused. "And the next morning it was wrong again and I went out and fixed it again. I kept coming back because every time I fixed it and went back inside, the day felt possible, not just sufficient, possible. And then there was you and you were." She stopped. "I was what?" Nelson asked very quietly. "You were someone who looked at the mountains as if they were saying something," she said. "And I thought that is a man who has not stopped looking for the right answers, and I wanted to know what you'd found." Nelson was quiet for a long time. "What have you found?" she asked. "This," he said. "Here, he paused. "I hadn't found it yet when you started fixing the gate. I was just managing, just running the ranch and getting through the years. You came across that road every morning before I was awake and fixed things that needed fixing, and eventually the thing that needed fixing was me." Susan looked at her husband in the summer dark and felt something so large and warm and complete that she did not try to put it into smaller words. "You weren't that broken," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I was a little broken. The important hinge had worked loose, needed resetting." She laughed. The full real laugh that she had discovered she gave him more easily than she had ever given anyone, and he smiled that full intensity smile in the dark, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch in the July night until the stars shifted and the air cooled, and then they went inside. Their son was born in early October of 1879, on a morning that came in blue and clear after a night of hard rain, and he was healthy and loud, and had, within the first hour, expressed strong opinions about the world that suggested he would continue to do so. Nelson held him at the bedroom window in the thin October light with an expression on his face that Susan watched from the bed with a fullness of heart she had not known she still had room for. "He needs a name," the doctor said, gathering his bag. Nelson looked at Susan. Susan looked at Nelson. This had been discussed at some length over the summer. "Thomas," Susan said, "for his first name, Thomas Nelson Garrett." Nelson looked at the baby and then at her, and she saw that he understood what she meant by it, that the past and the present were not enemies but could share a name, that loving what she had lost did not diminish what she had now, and that he was large-hearted enough to know it. "Thomas Nelson Garrett," he said, and it sounded right. Clara was at the house by midday, having been informed by Augusto Vila at 7 in the morning, and she stood over the cradle with the same unself-conscious tears she had wept at the wedding and said, "He's beautiful. He looks like both of you." "He looks like a very small, opinionated person," Nelson said. "That's what I said," Clara told him. "Both of you." The autumn moved in around them, the same gold and amber as the year before, and Susan was back on her feet inside the week, which horrified Dr. Marsh, and back in the kitchen garden assessing the winter preparation within 10 days, which horrified no one because it was simply what she did. Thomas Nelson Garrett was a good baby, which is to say he had a particular genius for sleeping at stretches that allowed his parents to sleep as well, and the Garrett house that had been quiet for 6 years was quiet no longer, filled now with the ordinary, extraordinary sounds of a family. Nelson took his son out to the paddock in November to see Franklin, who was now a fine young horse, and held the baby up at the fence with a solemnity that made Augusto, who was watching from a respectful distance, have to look at the sky for a moment. "He's 3 weeks old," Susan said, beside Nelson at the fence. "Franklin doesn't mind," Nelson said. Susan leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at the horse and the baby and the mountains behind them and the whole wide Colorado world, and thought, with a gratitude that was almost frightening in its depth, about a gate that had hung crooked in the September wind, and a woman who had crossed a road before dawn with a hammer and a handful of nails, and the way that the smallest acts of repair can be the beginning of something too large to have planned. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was long and cold and entirely good. The ranch was well prepared, the cattle in the lower pastures, the hay stores sufficient, the house stocked and warm. Susan sewed in the evenings by the fire with Thomas in the cradle beside her, and Nelson read or did his accounts at the table, and the life they were living was, in all its domestic solidity, the furthest possible thing from the quiet sufficiency she had feared in those first days in Cutter's Creek. There were hard things, because there always were. A section of the north fence came down in a January blizzard, and 3 cattle were lost to the cold before the hands could locate them. The spring brought a dispute with a neighbor over water rights to the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the ranch, a dispute that required 2 meetings with a lawyer in Denver, and a month of tension before it was settled in their favor. Samuel, the young cowhand from Kansas, left in the spring for the Wyoming Territory, where his brother had a homestead, and Nelson had to hire 2 men to replace him, which took time and judgment to manage. Susan handled the dry goods store dispute entirely on her own, when the new owner attempted to cut her wages, and those of 2 other part-time workers, with a casual confidence that Susan found educationally useful. She went to see him, presented a clear and specific account of the value of the work, and left with the original wages restored. Nelson heard about it from Hector Boyd's and came home that evening and looked at her across the kitchen table with a respect so unalloyed that she had to concentrate on the baby to avoid becoming excessively pleased with herself. "You didn't need my help," Nelson said. "I didn't," she agreed, "but I would have asked if I had." "That's all I need to know," he said. The spring of 1880 was their first full spring as a family, and it was the spring in which the Garrett Ranch front gate finally received the treatment it had deserved for years. Nelson ordered new hardware from the supply house in Denver, proper forged iron hinges of the correct weight rating for the gate's size, and a latch mechanism of quality that would last decades. When it arrived in April, Susan examined it piece by piece on the kitchen table with Thomas in her arms and a cup of coffee at her elbow, and pronounced it correct. They hung the new hardware on a Saturday morning in April, Nelson and Susan and Augusto, who was technically not needed but had made himself part of the project through sheer cheerful presence. It took the better part of the morning. Thomas sat in a wooden box Augusto had padded with a saddle blanket, installed a few feet from the work, and watched the proceedings with the profound, interested attention of a 6-month-old baby who believes that all activity in the world is fundamentally performed for his benefit. When the gate was hung and the latch set and the hinges tested and found perfect, Susan stood back and looked at it with her hands on her hips and the particular expression that Augusto had by now learned meant she was satisfied with something. "It's done," she said. "Properly done," Nelson said. "It won't need fixing again, not for years." "Then what will you do in the mornings?" Nelson asked, and there was something in his voice that was warm and knowing and entirely his. Susan looked at the gate for a moment, straight and true and swinging clean in the April morning breeze. Then she looked at Nelson, who was watching her in the early light with his hat in his hands and his dark eyes and the silver in his hair and the life they had built together right behind him, the house and the stable and Franklin in the paddock and the smoke from the kitchen chimney and their son in his padded box looking up at everything with absolute confidence in the world's goodwill. "I'll find something," she said. He smiled. "Yes," he said. "You will." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face gently with one finger in the way he had developed the habit of doing when he simply wanted to touch her and words were not the right tool. "I'll find something too," he said quietly. "You already have," she said. Augusto, who was pretending to inspect the gate post, said to no one in particular, "I told Rosa this would happen. I told her. Without me telling him her name, where would any of this be?" "Still fixing the gate," Susan said, and she was laughing, and Nelson was laughing, and even Thomas, startled by the sound, made the bright, uncertain noise that in a few months would become his own laugh, the one that would fill that house for years. And the April sun was on the mountains, and the gate stood straight and good at the entrance to the yard. And the world at this particular moment in Cutter's Creek, Colorado, in the year 1880, was in better repair than it had ever been. There would be more years after this one, many of them, and in them would be all the things that years contain, more children. A second son they called Henry, born in 1882, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn, capable hands. And after Henry, a daughter they called Anne, who arrived in 1884 with such force and determination that Dr. Marsh said he was not surprised given the parentage. There would be winters that were hard and springs that were wonderful and the long, grinding middle years of building something meant to last, and disputes with neighbors and droughts, and the particular challenges that came as the frontier slowly became something less wild and more settled, as the railroad pushed further and the towns grew, and the old open range began to close. Nelson would walk the north fence line with Susan until they were old, and she would always find something that needed fixing, not because things were always broken, but because the eye that looks for what can be improved does not turn off when the need is past. It simply finds new things to see. She would expand her sewing business until it was the most respected dressmaking operation between Denver and the Wyoming border, and she would teach me, and me would teach others, and the things Susan had built from a widow's needle and a borrowed iron, and a determination not to be only sufficient would become, over time, something real and lasting. Nelson would breed Franklin's line through the next decade, and the horses that came from him would be known in 3 territories for their quality. He would expand the ranch with the care and judgment that had always characterized him, never overreaching, always knowing the difference between what was possible and what was sound. He would become the kind of man that Cutter's Creek pointed to when it wanted to point to something it was proud of, not because he sought that, but because the thing he had built was genuinely worth pointing to. And in the mornings, all the mornings of all those years, Susan Slater, who had become Susan Garrett and was both of these things and more, woke before the sun and made her coffee and looked out the window at the gate that stood straight and true at the entrance to the yard, and felt, every single time, the particular simple satisfaction of something that had needed fixing and had been fixed. not by the gate, not by the hammer and the nails and the wire, and not even really by the month of mornings in the dark when she had crossed the road because the world needed attending to, and she was a woman who attended to things, but by the asking. By the morning Nelson Garrett had finally stood at his own gate and asked her why, and she had told him the truth as best she could, and he had told her his truth in return, and two people who had been alone and managing and just getting through had found each other in the early morning light with the tools of repair between them. The gate had been the beginning. The rest had been the life. And the life, all of it, every hard winter and good spring and ordinary irreplaceable morning of it, was more than sufficient. It was everything.